brief introduction. Once again, welcome. My name's Samantha Kulish-Fargione. I'm the Executive Director at the Weston Historical Society in Weston, Connecticut. And I want to welcome all of you to this evening's presentation of New England's Stone Walls, Stories and Conservation Priorities. We have our guest presenter, Robert M. Thorson, on with us today. And before we begin, I just have a few important reminders. I want to acknowledge our annual sponsors for the Weston Historical Society, Fairfield County Bank, and KMS Partners Compass. Thank you all for keeping your microphones and your cameras muted. We want to keep them muted during the presentation, so that way all eyes and ears can be on Professor Thorson. Like I had mentioned earlier, we will be having a Q&A at the end of the presentation, and we are going to be using the chat box or the chat feature. It's at the bottom of your screen. It looks like a speech bubble. So if you have a question, you can type it into the chat, and at the end of the presentation, I will go through and read the questions one by one to Professor Thorson for him to answer. And so just a brief mention about the Weston Historical Society and who we are. We're a 501c3 nonprofit cultural organization. We're located at 104 Weston Road in Weston, Connecticut. We're on the site of the Coley Homestead, which is a former working farm dating back to the mid-19th century. And if any of you are from the local area, I could see that some of you are, feel free to visit our grounds. Our buildings are not open, but the grounds are open during daylight hours, and it's a beautiful site to visit and picnic. So even though we're not physically open, we are keeping history alive by making it accessible to everyone at home. We have content, historical content on our website, westonhistoricalsociety.org. We have local history content for adults and for children. We're also going to be hosting another virtual lecture coming up on Wednesday, September 16th. At 7:30, and that lecture is called Stories of Connecticut Architecture, and it's with Christopher Wigren, who is the Deputy Director of Preservation Connecticut. So you can register for that event on our website. We also have a virtual tour of our newest exhibit, which is Daniel E. Offutt III, Benefactor and Friend to Weston, Connecticut. And we are continuing to work on our next exhibit, Weston Slept While the Nation Roared, Life in the 1920s. And we hope to open that exhibit in person in 2021. Like so many nonprofit organizations right now, we have had to cancel all of our fundraisers this year. So we would greatly appreciate it if you could support us at this time. So if you'd like to donate or if you'd like to become a member of the Weston Historical Society, you can do that right on our website, westonhistoricalsociety.org, and you can find all the information on our support page. So thank you in advance if you are able to contribute. Now, I would like to introduce our guest presenter, Robert M. Thorson. He is a STEM physical scientist and head of UConn's Department of Geoscience. He's an expert on New England environmental history via Stone Walls and Henry David Thoreau. He has written several books since 1998. A few that I'd like to mention: Stone by Stone, The Magnificent History of New England's Stone Walls, and Exploring Stone Walls, a field guide to New England's stone walls. Professor Thorson has taken part in thousands of presentations, trips, consulting jobs, trainings over the years. He's also a retired journalist, writing for 15 years for the Hartford Courant. And he's an elected fellow of the Geological Society of America, as well as an elected member of the American Antiquarian Association. So without further ado, I would like to present Robert M. Thorson. Thorson. And Robert, you can go ahead and unmute yourself unless you need me to do that for you. Oh, there you go.
Okay, can everybody hear me? I hope so. Nod, yeah, there you go. Okay, it's a pleasure to be here. Before I move into my own presentation, I just happen to have a book by Christopher Widgren about Connecticut architecture. So I'm gonna put a plug in for the September 16th talk. I'm kind of a strange geologist because on that night I won't be able to attend because I'll be guest lecturing for RISD in Rhode Island on landscape architecture. I'm really into all of these sorts of things. My goal is to give a fairly brief introduction through a series of slides, and I don't have a script that I'm following, so I'm just gonna look at them and talk. And I aim to finish early enough that, that we can have a lot of Q&A. And I will let Sam run the QA. It's a real pleasure to be here, and thank you again for the invite. And thank you for joining from far away. Okay, New England stone walls. I think I ought to start out by saying that I did not grow up in New England. I'm a native sodbuster, Scandinavian American, upper Midwest, and I moved here from Alaska after years in Seattle, and I had never seen a stone wall until I actually moved here in 1984 as a professor. And so I was just smitten right off the bat by them because I didn't grow up knowing what they were. And as a trained scientist, especially with graduate courses in cold soils and archaeology and things like that, I was fascinated by the actual processes of how they came to be. And people laughed at me when I said I was interested in them because everybody knows the answer, but it turns out that there's a lot of science that still is waiting to be done. And so that was my introduction, somebody who'd never seen a stone wall before. Now we can move to the next slide. Okay, Weston's pandemic real estate market. This was in the Wall Street Journal just this last week. And the basic idea is real estate prices are rising in Weston because it's within reach of New York City, where urban living is being trying for some people now. And the interesting thing to me is that on the lead cover article there's a stone wall right there. Not a wall in the woods, but at least there's one authentic boulder there. And so I wanted to say that, yeah, stone walls actually pay off well for real estate because they are the signature landform of New England. And you really know that you're here when you see them. Of course, they can exist everywhere else, but they're really, really diagnostic here. So let's move on to the next one. Okay, so I have an outline for a talk. And I've got some opening thoughts. I think there's 2 or 3 of them. And these don't go anywhere. They're just things that I want you to think about. And they are related to each other. And then a few stories, just a couple, not too long. And then I want to hone in the most important takeaway point that stone walls are the rural signature landform of rural interior New England. That's really, really important. And I'm going to try and explain why. I used to have a lot of people visit me, and when they left, they'd write a thank you note back in the old days, and they would say, "Oh, and those walls, I'd never seen anything like that." When they come from other parts of the country, as I didn't come from here. So when I showed up here, they seemed to be the salient feature on the landscape internally. And then some key messages. I differentiate these a little bit. There might be 4 or 5 in each. There are 4 cultural messages I just want to share with you. Things that are earthly, mostly about earth science, and then something to do with the management of stone walls. And then we may not get to this, but 3 models for conservation of stone walls, nationally, regionally, and locally. So that's my basic plan. And we can just move to the next slide. Okay, what you see there is that signature slide there. When you get that, that's like the commercial break between segments of the talk. And I'll explain what that is later, but so this means we're about to go to a section of the talk called opening thoughts. Next slide. Okay, there's no such thing as prehistory. That's a thought. Where does it go? Well, to a geologist, the goal is to work out the history of the earth. You're just not using written documents. And an archaeologist does the same thing with artifacts. So I just don't like the word prehistory because it would obviate most of what I do, which is trying to work out the history of things. And also there's an awful lot of inference and induction and scientific analysis of things in the historic time period that documents just do not address. And I would argue that stone walls are among the most important. So there I built a wall out of dead watches and stones. I think the artistic message is pretty clear there, that there's a lot of time and there's a lot of stability. Next. Humans and nature are one and the same. Now, you don't have to agree with that, but it's just a point that I want to make. I think the dualism between uh, humans and nature is disappearing fast in the Anthropocene. I'm teaching the geology program's most highest enrolled course on the human epoch, or the Anthropocene. Human beings are the dominant geologic agency on the planet. We move more material than did the ice sheets on average for the last 2 million years, and 5 times more than all the rivers put together as a rate. So human beings are moving more material, doing more things, participating and promulgating extinctions, changing the climates in the atmospheres. We're just giving the surface of the earth quite a workover. And so it's not as though human beings have something separate from the environment. We essentially have become, the driving agency for much of the environment we look at. And my model is that much of the environment, it may sound, you may not appreciate this, but is to think about just a golf course that's global in scale. It's a managed property, including the roughs and the woods that are not being, managed actively. And you can commit through commission and through omission environmental management. We leave some things alone and we do things actively. It's called landscape architecture or engineering. And then, of course, there are the consequences of things that happen that we didn't plan that are really, really important. So humans and nature are one and the same. If you believe in human nature, then you can't decouple that too. And I believe in human nature. Next slide. Okay, so now we'll get this slide. All stories are embedded and have gaps. All stories are embedded. We know this about our own lives. We know this about our towns. We know this, every historical society understands this. All historians do. And so I wanted you to look at this picture. It was just a stone wall that I was looking at in Hillstead, which is in Farmington, Connecticut. The landscape, not that different from parts of Weston. And what you see there in the middle is a red boulder, and it looks like it's been painted, but that's not paint. That's a hydrothermal precipitate, a volcanic hydrothermal precipitate of the mineral called jasper on the surface of a rock fracture. And so that was just a stone and a wall. But if you look in the lower left, you'll see a rounded sort of granite gneiss pebble. If you look in the upper right, you'll see a piece of basalt, just lava that cooled. And then you'll see on the upper left, a piece of brownstone. This is the stuff that, lines so many architectural buildings in cities, especially a lot of public libraries in New England. But there's an actual fragment of it that is part of a stone wall. So what I want you to know is that there are lots of stories here. And if you train yourself to read them, it becomes pretty straightforward. But the key idea here is they're embedded. Each rock has its own story. That is, the material is the rock. The stone is the object made of rock. So the rock you're looking at in the middle is basically a lava flow, a basalt, okay, but it's coated with hydrothermal mineralization. There may have been geysers working in Connecticut when that was taking place. Then there's the stone. The stone has a history of breaking up the rock and milling it in the bottom of an ice sheet or moving it around or sorting it. And then finally, the wall has its own history. And the wall is basically a human-built phenomenon. But there's intent and purpose and chronology. So those three things, rock, stone, wall, and even the modern surface, are a blend of everything, and you cannot decouple that history. Next slide. You can take it apart piece by piece, but you can't decouple it. Okay, now the signature landform. Again, a key point that I want to get across. Let's move ahead. Okay, that's a picture of Block Island from Beacon Hill. It's an uncopyrighted photo that some historical society person took in 1880 and saved and recovered. The end of the pier is on the left in the water, and the tallest hotel is on the right. I went back and took a picture of that same place, and it is all oak scrub forest when you look at it. So the walls are still there, but we can't see them. That's because people abandoned the agricultural land and the trees came back. And we can see them now through LiDAR, which we'll get to later, but in a picture like this, just think about that. New England has got a lot of walls. Now, Block Island probably has a higher concentration, but not much. There are lots of places with this many walls. We just don't see them all at once. Next slide. Walls are important to the regional identity. And when I say region, I mean a circle. and a circle around that red dot there, which I would put on Worcester, Mass, sort of like the center of it. And the triangle just sort of is the epicenter of this phenomenon. Note that it takes in southern Maine, all that dairy country. It takes in most of New Hampshire and Vermont, where the walls are. It takes in Fairfield County, Connecticut, obviously, and it has to take in Nantucket on the lower right. And so if you just drew a circle around that phenomenon, that's like 100 miles, it would take in most of the phenomenon. And everywhere within that region, okay, we have stone walls whenever it's possible, whenever it's remotely possible, given the circumstances that I will explain later. So they have really become important. Next slide. Now, you can find sugar maples and church steeples and congregational churches and so forth all the way to Minnesota. In fact, Minneapolis used to be a New England West before statehood. We think of Minneapolis, where I'm from. I'm basically from Minnesota. We think of it as a sort of a Scandinavian overlay, when of course somebody named Thorson, whose mother is named Anderson, and Ericssons and Olsons, they're all over my family. Yes, we're Scandinavian immigrants from the post Moral Act, or the civil, the Homestead Act. That's basically my family. But just before statehood in 1858, Minneapolis was a very, very New Englandy place. They knew how to do the milling and the forestry and the banking and the commerce. And when Henry Thoreau went there in 1861, just before he died, he visited Minnesota, and he said half of the people he met were from Massachusetts, and that all of the lumbermen were from Maine. So it was a very New Englandy sort of a place. And so the New Englanders migrated west through upstate New York and into Ohio and into Indiana. And they took that New England culture with them all the way to the west, but they couldn't take the stone walls. Okay, so in New England, we have, town greens and sugar maples and church steeples, but we also have stone walls in the background. And there's a Venn diagram in the left there. And the idea is that there's a yellow circle, a red circle, and a blue circle. And they each represent something different. And the phenomenon of stone walls, shown in the upper left, exists only when all three intersect. And those three things are, first of all, you have to have hard rock. Now I'm talking about the blue. We got plenty of hard rocks in New England. I mean high-grade granites, crystalline metamorphic rocks, quartzites, lava flow rocks, basalts. We need those hard rocks. The glacier picks them up, crunches away, but it doesn't quickly crush them. If you were to go west to upstate New York, the stone walls disappear because the rocks go soft. There's sandstones, shales, limestone. Yeah, they're in the Adirondacks and here and there and down in Westchester, but basically if you go west, you lose the stone walls because the rocks go soft. And the glacier picks them up and just crushes them. Now, we've still got glacier soils over there in upstate New York, and we still have that livestock tillage culture that people use to keep the animals and the crops apart. And it's sort of the standard, North European immigrant technology here to this landscape. So two things stay the same, but what changes is the rocks go soft, so you lose the stone walls. Now, if you go from Fairfield County and there's just stone walls everywhere, if you go down on the other side of the Big Apple down into central New Jersey, you don't see any stone walls. And basically what happens is you still have much the same, sort of livestock tillage culture, agrarian society down there. And you also have hard rocks at depth. There's plenty of hard rocks down there in New Jersey, although in places they're covered by thick soils. But the key thing is you don't have the glacier bottom soils. The ice sheet, as you know, terminated near New York City and Long Island and Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket. That's the southern edge of the ice sheet here. In New England. And so if you were to go south into the Atlantic coastal plain states or the mid-Atlantic, you basically don't have stone walls because you don't have glacial soils, even though the other two variables are the same. And the third one is in Maine. Southern Maine is full of stone walls, and it's a farm dairy culture. But if you go to the Northwest, it goes into a woods wilderness culture and a mineral extraction culture. And so what happens is you lose the stone walls, not because the rocks aren't hard and not because we don't have good glacier bottom soils, but you lose it because you don't have that farm culture anymore. And so it's only in New England. New England is the only place where all three of these things go together. And so they're everywhere. In New England, the problem is explaining where stone walls are not. If you go outside the region, there are stone walls here and there in almost every state, but usually they require local explanations. In New England, it's everywhere. So they become the binding threads for the whole landscape. I like that metaphor. They're the binding threads to the other important historic places. In and of themselves, they're often not important places, but they hold them together in a fabric or a net. And so they're really, really important. They're intrinsic to the region because of the three factors I just pointed out. Okay, let's move on. Okay, good, I got that done. Couple of key messages. We can have lots to talk about. Go ahead. Okay, now we're going to do the cultural messages. And I'm just going to show you a slide, say a little bit about it, and move on. And you can be jotting down questions for me when we're done. Next slide. Okay, they're time machines. The thing about history is it's way more than just the documentary record or even the human artifacts. It's everything we've done to the landscape, and the most salient and the most tangible and the most direct and the most evocative are the stone walls in the woods. This is just the standard generic Eastern Connecticut stone wall, of which there are tens of thousands of miles of them. And my students see these all the time, and they can't help but think that human beings are geologic agents because they're standing below the closed canopy forest. And these, to me, are just as authentic as other documents. They will not have the implicit human bias, that might color a document to be interpreted one way or another, or written in one way or another. They're just simply what happened on the landscape when people put hands to stone and did what they had to do. And a lot of it was not done, with a lot of great thought in mind. So they're an authentic, first person, plurality, everyone gets to vote by moving stone kind of a thing. And they really, really tie the landscape together. And for me, they will never end being the most viscerally evocative thing. When I see one, I know something important is going on. So they're time machines. Next slide. Okay, we have a reverence for stone. I don't think I need to tell you that. You signed up here, you came to listen to this. And I like this scene on the left because it's just a generic roadside wall in Woodstock, Vermont, but it shows all of the elements that I think are important, to the New England landscape. But first of all, we have a reverence, and I want to go through this list here. There is an atavistic or sort of primitive response that I have when I see stone. And I don't know where that comes from, but I can guess. It's through my own deep genetic roots as an evolved species. Spiritual. I think rock is the be all end all, just about, for me. And I don't need to overlay it with a Bronze Age biblical story. But if you do that, rock is everywhere in the old books, the books of Moses, if you like. If you go back there, it's just about everywhere. And God is effectively a rock in several statements. Graveyards. Why do we rim our graveyards with stone? Well, I think I know. And I've invented a term that is getting a little traction, so I'd appreciate you spreading it around. It's the counterpart to transcendentalism. Now, we think we know what that is in American history. It's a wonderful romantic movement that captured the nation, or at least a small part of the nation, centered out of Concord, Mass., modeled after the romantic movements of Europe. But my counterpart is that if you read carefully the works of Henry David Thoreau, and in fact, I'm reading other books right now. I'm reading one right now. I'm reviewing one for the Wall Street Journal. It's all about going down to the rock and finding meaning and stability and solidity in rock. And that's what I call descendentalism. That's where reality is. The stuff above that, the softer stuff, it's not as solid, let's put it that way. You know you're on something solid when you're on rock. And I'd like to just take a look at the picture on the left. That has basically Earth history in a nutshell. And Earth history starts with rock. That's an aspect of descendentalism, down to the rock. Everything once was rock. There was no real atmosphere that we know today. There was no ocean, there was no life, there's no nothing. It's all rock. And when you heat it up and boil it, all the volatiles boil out of it and become the atmosphere. So rock precedes air. And then, of course, when the planet cools enough, that air can precipitate, the water that was all above the surface at that point. And we replace a lava ocean with a blue ocean, and we become a blue planet for the first time. So rock precedes the air, which precedes the water. And then of course, life, here shown by the trees or by the grass, you know, that has to have water. So rock precedes the air, which precedes the water, which precedes the life. And then of course, you're looking at the wall itself, and that is a manifestation of intelligence, question mark, intelligence. And so of course, life has to precede intelligence. So the whole history of the earth in a nutshell goes from rock to air to water to life to intelligence. And so I think one of the reasons that I like scenes like this is that I can see all of it in that picture as I walk by. Next slide. Okay, a couple of readings here. I just love this book by Simon Schama, Landscape and Memory. It's a fat doorstopper book on architectural history. It's pretty darn big. And I decided to end my book Stone by Stone with a quote that he had there. And it applies to Weston too. And here's what he says. There are places within the boundaries of modern metropolitan sprawl. We can put Weston in there. Yes, it's rural, but it's not rural like Eastern Montana. It's what I call ruburbia. And that is you can live a beautiful semi-rural existence, but be within a half hour of a good coffee shop or a university library or a medical facility. So I call it ruburbia. There are places woven within the boundaries of modern metropolitan sprawl where the boundaries between past and present, wild and domestic, collapse altogether. From the midst of the suburban wilderness, in the hours before dawn, barely a fair way away from the inevitably manicured country club, coyotes howl at the moon, setting off a frantic shrieking from the flocks of wild turkeys hidden in the covers. This is Thoreau's kind of suburb. I agree. He chose to live in one. If you're in Weston, you do, and I certainly do in Mansfield, Connecticut. The other quote that I think is really relevant to a historical society is on page 196. And I'm doing the book Stone by Stone now, which is, I'll show you the beat up copy. Here's the beat up copy. There was a picture on the advertisement. The medallion for winner of the Connecticut Book Award is completely worn off. I've been carrying this for about 15 years. I'm going to go to 196 now and read why I think stone walls are so important. And what I'd like to do is a convincing explanation for the delayed reverence for stone walls. You know, we really didn't care about them very much until about the Impressionist movement, and then a little bit past that. A convincing explanation for the delayed reverence for what was once commonplace comes from a short, seminal, and obscure but important work by J.B. Jackson. He's a landscape writer, J. Brinkerhoff Jackson. He said that historical preservation, I'm going to quote this now, I'm going to quote him, and that's because I'm talking at a historical society, so I want you to hear this loud and clear. You know it already. Historical preservation, quote, sees history not as continuity, but as a dramatic discontinuity, a kind of cosmic drama. First, there has to be that golden age, the time of harmonious beginnings. Then ensues a period when the old days are forgotten and the golden age falls into neglect. Finally comes a time when we rediscover and seek to restore the world around us to something like its former beauty. From there, but there has to be that interval of neglect. There has to be discontinuity. It is religiously and artistically essential. That is what I mean when I refer to the necessity for ruins. The old order has to die before there can be a born-again landscape. And I think you know the rest. The old order of rural New England died slowly during the latter half of the 19th century when the population from upland farming towns became intoxicated by the industrial power of cities and hired by the promise of the West. Conservative talk about the nobility of agriculture did little to stop the exodus of Yankee youth. New England had entered its interval of neglect. And then it goes on and on and on. I think it's very, very important to have that neglect. So those are just a couple of quotes. Next slide, please. Okay, we also have a necessity for heroes. And I've got a really wild idea that's waiting to be studied as a dissertation by somebody, but nobody's taken me up on it. And that is that I've got a chapter in the book, or a mention, on what I call the Eastern cowboy. And he's the hero dealing with the surplus of stone. And there really isn't that much of a surplus of stone. If you look at it quantitatively, if you look at it from the air, if you think about how long it took to move that stone and what the actual volumes are, yes, they're enormous. But the number of people we have moving stone for a century is plenty to do that without any heroics. But yet we've made the hardscrabble farmer the heroic, and we've exaggerated the stoniness of our soils. Yes, they're real stony in some places, but not everywhere. And so what I think we did was that the Western cowboy was, it's the macho man with the animal companion, who's the horse, and then the Indian. Well, who's the Indian in the post-Civil War America? Who's the enemy? It's going to be the indigenous peoples. Now that's just brute, raw, genocidal history, but that's just the way it is. So the cowboy craze depended on those three things: the animal companion, the imagined enemy, and the macho man. And in the East, what do we have? We've got the hardscrabble farmer working against an enemy. The enemy is the stone, and the animal companion is the ox or the draft horse. Next slide. I think a lot of this is mythology, and it's invented. And folk art. Somebody asked me if I'd give a talk on stone walls and folk art. It never occurred to me. So I went to the library. I got a barrel full of books on folk art, and I became an instant expert in a couple of nights. And basically, the definition, there are folk art museums and experts and degrees and all of that. But basically, they're simple, they're handcrafted, they're unique, and yet they follow within a constraining form. You think about the racist cigar store Indian. You think about the weather vanes. You think about common forms, stars on the side of barns, whatever. That's folk art. So is a stone wall. Every single wall has some idiosyncratic component put in there by the farmer. It might be mostly mundane, but I have never seen two walls alike. They're like folk art. They're all handcrafted from local materials within a constraining form, and there you have it. Next slide. Mary Oliver and Robert Frost both wrote extraordinary poems about stone walls. The most famous one is Mending Wall by Robert Frost. And he captured some really interesting things in that poem. I mean, I actually read about that poem when I was a kid following my parents around in Illinois, when I was a middle schooler. What he's got is actually two walls there blended together. He wrote that poem in England, looking back, and deliberately combined the wall on one side of his property with the wall on the other, because the one side is the good fences make good neighbor wall, the flat and slabby wall, and the other side is the rounded stones that are always falling apart that require considerable repair. They may as well be balls or lobes that are all falling apart. That's New England working hard to maintain itself. He really caught that. And Mary Oliver's Knife is really a poem about stability. It's about the wall just sits there and life goes by. Well, the wall isn't just sitting there, it's changing constantly, but at a rate that is much slower than that. So I recommend these two poems. They're widely available on the internet. Next slide. Native sacred stones. They are around. There are piles, there are decorative items, there are short walls, there are turtle motifs, there may be standing stones, we don't know. There's all kinds of stuff out there, but the vast, vast majority of it is likely tied to, the main thing, which is the Euro-American expansion and an agricultural civilization. And the default explanation is that a pile is a pile, that precedes a wall. But this is a very, very important part of land management now, is to take the Native Americans' point of view into account and treat them with fairness and respect. But at the same time, we need to come up with rules for what are we going to do, what is a sacred stone, and what is merely a pile, and what is an erratic, and what is a sacred stone. It's not such a clear-cut definition. Next slide. Okay, now I've done some cultural messages about Native Americans, about reverence for time, about about the necessity for ruins and the necessity for heroes. And now I'm going to talk about a few earthly things. So let's do the next slide. Okay, now I love this picture. I'm missing the, it's basically in Finnish Lapland. What you see there is a set of squares and hexagons in Finnish Lapland. And there's a sorting mechanism that moves the coarse stone away from the slightly raised centers where it's mostly fine-grained material. And you end up with a nice polygonal pattern of what look like primitive stone walls around Connecticut fields. And so what I'd like you to do is think about New England stone walls, not in their finished form, you know, where they're beautiful walls or fences or well-built edges or fancy walls, but the vast majority are really, really simple. And they're about knee-high, and they're made of two-handers, and they aren't laid, they're simply stacked. The classic farmer's wall, the pasture wall, the throne wall, the tossed wall, there's all these synonyms for them. But I'd like you to think about beavers. You know, they're engineering their environment, you know, without trying to, you know, leave a legacy. They're just trying to do their job. And I think farmers did much the same. I want you to think about ants. You know, ants build beautiful anthills, but the beauty of their hills is incidental to their real job of just making a place to live their underground life. And I could read some more, but I don't think I want to. If you have a copy of Stone by Stone, it's on page 217. There's a nice little story about ants and ecofacts there. So I want you to think of the stone walls as being, yes, they're cultural, but they are also ecological. And that's a whole lecture if we want to get into that. Next slide. Yes, I showed you some of those frost polygons. One of these pictures has no walls at all, and it's just you know, they're just frost polygons in the Arctic. And one of them is a pattern of stone walls in Petersham, Massachusetts, just standard interior New England. My argument is the patterns are not that different. They are not that different, and that you can have fractal natural patterns that might be responsible for some of our stone walls. The size is right, the pattern is right, the fractal subdivision is right. To say that human beings are operating you know, within the context of the larger agro-ecosystem, not doing it all on their own. Next slide. I'm going to make it. Physics. I think we know which side the cattle and horses are on. Okay. Basically, hooved animals that nibble grass for a living are really, really hard on soils. Okay. So when you clear the trees away, and if you clear the trees and let them grow back, there's really no real net change in the soil. But if you clear the trees and keep it cleared, especially if you put grazing animals on there, you cause major changes in the microclimate, in the conductivity of the soil. You change the way frost heave works. You change the way spring runoff works. You change the depth of freeze. You lose the organic matter in the soil. It becomes a better conductor of heat. And on we could do a whole lecture on how you change the physics of the soil just by turning New England from forest into farm. There's been a lot of talk about how that happened historically and chronologically, but not physically. Physically, what happens to the heat capacity, the thermal conductivity, the infiltration capacity, you know, and the organic content of a soil when you clear it and put animals on top of it? Basically, you make the soil stony, and stone that wasn't at the surface came to the surface during that conversion as a human impact, an unintentional human impact of making the soils stonier. But you know what? They're not going to be endlessly stony, because eventually they run out of stone because there was a finite amount to be heaved up, notwithstanding all the jokes to the contrary. Next slide. Okay, there's a chronology here. We think of stone walls as being built right off the bat when Euro-Americans arrived, and indeed they were, especially in the coastal cities and villages. And we tend to think of them as colonial, but most are not. But the fact is that in most areas, Weston is sort of on the marginal zone, you know, where you've had people around for several centuries doing this agricultural work. But in some places, like in upstate New Hampshire, they're only there for 30 or 40 years. That is, they arrive late and they leave early. And in Weston, they arrive a little earlier and they leave a little later. But the same basic thing holds. People come, they cut the trees, the soils are changing, the climates are changing, the microclimates, that is. The walls accumulate the stone accumulates along fence line. as what you might say call a linear landfill, if you like. But then what happens is the stone becomes a problem. It becomes, you can use it now. You can't do much with 1 penny, but you can do a lot with 1 billion pennies. Okay, so what happens is if you have 1 billion stones, you can start doing things with them that you couldn't be before, and you're also incentivized to get them out of the way. So the best thing to do is to go straight up. Walk into a library, the books are definitely stacked. If they were all just lying around on the floor, you couldn't walk around in the library. You'd be walking on top of books. The same thing is true with our stones. If you stack them on the edge of the wall rather than just tile them, you know, then they take up a whole lot less space and you can do a lot more. Yes, there's a fencing function. Yes, there's a boundary marking function, but these are all parts of things subsumed into the larger agroecological changes that gave us our stone walls. Next slide. There's one of the cool things is I need to tell you what the Anthropocene is. The Anthropocene is the human epoch. It's the human beings have changed the planet so much. You know, there's all this talk about the climate crisis, and indeed that's true. But human beings have changed the face of the planet so much that we need a new geologic epoch to contain this activity, because things are very, very different. And there's one key global date, which is around 1950. And that's the beginning of the so-called Great Acceleration of concrete and plastic and population and international flights and, you know, travel everywhere. I mean, really, really things picked up in 1950. And so that's going to be the boundary, the basal boundary for a new epoch called the Anthropocene, the official Anthropocene. But throughout much of the world, the unofficial or the regional or the early Anthropocene, you know, begins as early as 45,000 years in Australia, when human beings arrived, 45,000 years, and the extinction just took wham. You know, they had a whole new different fauna after that. And here in New England, the marker is roughly 1607, when we had our first settlement in New England. It was at the mouth of the Kennebec in Maine. There was a sort of a northern Virginia settlement up at the Popham Beach in Maine. But Pilgrims land in 1620, and you know, it doesn't matter. But you know, somewhere in the late or the mid 17th century to 18th, you know, those people arrive, they cut down the trees, they do their thing. So that's the beginning date for the regional Anthropocene. So there's really two dates. The global one is 1950, and the one we're most interested in New England is the one at about you know, early 17th century. Think about the you know, the Colombian 1492 date. You know, if you're down in the Caribbean, that's the date of change. And there's a different date everywhere. Next slide. Okay, pretty good. Let's go to management. I'm going to be done. Let's go. Okay, conservation. This is the basic stone wall in the woods. What I'd like to say is right now, don't strip mine stone walls and turn them into stone for patios. Don't do that. So I'd like an immediate cease and desist. I've been a stump evangelist for stonewall conservation since 1998. And this is part of that too. Second, education. I'm concerned with how few children there are in lots of places. There's even a baby unbussed in the COVID now. But beyond that, you know, it's really, really important to get kids outside and educate them about the whole landscape, with human beings being part of it. I think a nice part of it, not always nasty negativeness. And I think we needed to work on incentives so that every property owner does the right thing with stone walls because they choose to do so, not because someone's forcing them to do this or that. I know that's a tricky business. There's no way I could get through a talk if I just got hung up on that point. But I really do want to conserve the New England landscape, because our diagnostic signature landform 10 years ago or 20 years ago when I got started, they were strip mining these all over the place. The New York Times asked me to write an opinion piece on that, and I did. Next slide. Okay, when you get the attorneys involved, you need to define what a stone wall is. And believe it or not, it's not that simple. It's a lot like, you know, the difference between art and pornography. You know, what's the difference between a pile and a wall? You know, if you're gonna say that walls have to be conserved or managed in some way in your town, you need a good definition of them. And to my mind, there are 5 criteria for that. 1, it has to be made of stone, natural or artificial, and I don't even like that that binary. And granularity on the right. The stone wall is made of pieces of stone, not one great big block of stone. Okay, so that's a stone wall. It's a granular thing. And then it has to be continuous. The one on the lower left, that's not a stone wall because you can walk right through it. It's plenty high enough, but it's not continuous. The one in the middle, elongation. The thing there is a lovely little cairn sitting on a boulder. That's not a stone wall because it's not long enough. If it were 4 times longer than it is wide, then it meets my arbitrary criteria. And that's, I emphasize the word arbitrary. That was an empirical one derived by asking lots and lots of people. But otherwise, that would be a stone wall. And finally, on the lower right, a wall has to be high enough to be a wall. That's not a wall there because it isn't even ankle high. If it's made of single stones like that, they have to be, knee-high-ish. And if they have any stones sitting on stone, then that's high enough, just by virtue of having stones sitting on top of each other. Okay, almost done. Let's move on. Okay, the taxonomy. I'm working on this. I'm a couple of days away from submitting an article. It's been on the web for 10 years. I'm continuously improving this. Everything made of stone is in what I call the stone domain. Walls are one class of 4 in the stone domain. There are also concentrations that you might call a cairn. There are lines, and then there are isolated notable stones. But let's move past. You can go get this online. Next slide. Okay, I'm working hard to try and inventory and map them at the town, state, and regional nation. Everybody is busy mapping right now because we have LiDAR on the lower left. I think you can see the pattern of walls in the lower left that you can't see in the upper left. Where the forest is there. You can literally see right through the forest. That LiDAR mapping is a whole talk in itself. Next slide. Okay, models. Let's move on. 3 basic models: national, regional, and local. All right, this is a book I recommend for managers. It's Conservation in America. It's written by the former director of the National Park Service and a conservation manager, but the 3 criteria are equally important for making decisions in our national parks, and I would argue in our community parks. Do them based on the best science. In other words, map and describe and collect and get information. Your management must have fidelity to law, or you get in trouble, and the long-term public interest, not the short-term. Duality. Nature and culture should not be separated in management decisions. And it's one thing, administration. Nature conservation, historic preservation, ecosystem services, environmental justice, sustainability, healthcare, and science are all managed together on the landscape. Next slide. Regional. Let's go next one. New Hampshire is doing a mapping project. I'm sort of peripherally involved in helping them get started. They've mapped over 7,000 miles of stone walls. Citizen Science doing their own mapping out in projects. It's really fantastic. So they're setting the stage here. And why not? They're really defined by their stone walls. Next slide. And locally, the Stonewall Initiative is something that I've tried to keep up for many, many years. There are months when it's active and months when it's not so active because I'm basically, but you can go here for lots of resources. I'll be improving it as I can. And there are recommendations under administration and conservation for any question you might have. And if not, just write me. I'm happy to help you. Next slide. So that's it. I made it. Thanks. That's my talk. We're back. Remember, there's a lot of key points. It's recorded. You can listen to it again. It's probably available to you in some other way. Thank you, Sam, for organizing it and putting it up. And now I'm ready to go at questions. And I look forward to having you unmute and asking your question. Or it's on, Sam, it's your thing now. I'll stay on, but you can manage anything else.
Yeah, all right. Yeah, you stay on. So Todd has a question. He says, can you discuss why the pre-European Homo sapiens did not commence the, and hopefully I can pronounce this word, Anthropocene in New England? There were humans here for a long time before 1607.
Yeah, I think fundamentally, we're talking about the indigenous inhabitants. And, they're basically the Algonquian speaking natives that are here in various classifications of tribes. We have federally recognized tribes, but if you take that back to several hundred years past the historic record, it's clear that the language types are still together and the archaeology unifies them. But there have been people here since the deglaciation. I think the oldest in Connecticut is 12,500 years. We now have good solid dates for the Paleolithic in New England. But we don't have large walls. We don't have patterns of stone walls. We don't have lots of stone being moved around, except perhaps for pieces of indigenous artwork. It just wasn't part of the lifestyle or the land management practice, and so we didn't get walls because we didn't really create lots of stone on the surface because the forests weren't cleared. So the short answer to that is that before the arrival of the Euro-Americans, who had a cultural economy based on clearing the trees and turning it into farms. Before that, yes, there is agriculture by the indigenous inhabitants, but it tends to be localized. It tends to be down on the river floodplains and sand plains, down near fresh flowing streams, and or in marsh and meadows in the inland regions. Not on the hillsides that generated so much of the stone. So we just didn't get very much wall. I hope I answered that question.
And Amanda has a question. She asks, has the soil on former pasture land now recovered?
I would say recovered to what? And I'm guessing the question is the baseline of what it was like before here. And I would say no, because what happens is that the ice sheets disappeared around, say, Weston. I think you're deglaciated about 18 to 17,000 years ago, maybe in Weston. And so what you have is you don't have serious organic material and in bogs and kettles and soils until about 15,000. So for about 3,000 years, it's just a moonscape of stone and, dwarf willow hanging out here and there and some heath plants, sort of standard tundra plants, a lot of sedge, but not really trees. And beginning around 12,500 years ago, we began to get a spruce parkland, a nice, well-developed conifer spruce parkland with a lot of sedge and grass and spruce. And then that went to pine, and then that went to our mixed forest about 7,000 or 8,000 years ago. And that's when the soils really began to start thickening and deepening. So I would say from 8,000 years on, you've got a lot of time to slowly fractionate the soil, bury the stone, and develop a mulch or a fine-grained soil on top of that. And we've only had about 200 years in a lot of places where the farms have been abandoned. And so we're not quite at 8,000 years worth of activity. Our soils are still thinner, and the loamy part, the biomantle is what it's called, that is not fractionated very thickly anymore. So no, they haven't recovered their former, but they're recovered to the point where they're in the process of stone getting more buried instead of less buried. So I hope I answered your question.
Joseph has a question. He says, we live in the Catskills and have 2 stone walls defining our property. Is that unusual?
Well, I wish I knew the geography a little bit better. Basically, when I say New England, I mean everything east of the Hudson. That's a seam in North America where the old part, the Catskills are basically sedimentary rocks. There was a great big delta that shed west when they built the mountains in New England. And there's a lot of soft sedimentary rocks that's dissected, into relief. That is, the ruggedness there is due to downcut into ridges and ravines, not that different from parts of the Appalachian Plateau. The Catskills are like a high version of that. And the stones, there's stones there that are hard enough, but the glacier, you pick up most of them and crush them. But there are places in the Catskill where the stones are rough enough and strong enough or post-glacial enough to have stone. If you get near the Hudson in any way, some of that New England stone is carried to the west because it's not a river flowing down the Hudson, it's like an ice lobe. And so the particles on the New England side are mixed into the bottom as they're sheared around and moved southward. So a lot of them ended up on the west side of the Hudson. So there's a lot of stone walls in the basically the lower Hudson Valley on both sides, even though more of it is concentrated on the east side because the rocks are harder. But in the Catskills, I don't know a lot about the stone walls. I know they're not ubiquitous. I know that there's been enough people and enough money and enough interest in stone walls to hire their construction, even based on importing stone. But there are ledges of sandstone and limestone that are and sort of mudstones and stuff that are making stone walls in the Catskills, but it's not ubiquitous, and it's not made of the same hard rock that I know of. But I'm not an expert there, so I'm sorry I don't know too much about that. Okay.
Jessica has a question. She asks, is there much geographical variation in stone composition, or did the glaciers mix everything together in New England?
That's a great question. I would say that the answer of that is on about 4 pages in Exploring Stone Walls. And the way I look at that is that I just ignored all the state boundaries in New England. I divided it up the way I want, and I ended up with about 5 different regions. And then with each of those regions, there are, you can map what I call provinces of stone walls where they do hang together. And it's basically, what is the rock made of? You know, if it's blocky granite, you know, blocky gneiss and granite, you get a different looking wall from if it's layered rock, schist and fine grained gneiss and quartzite. And then if you have soft rock, you basically don't have walls. And you can have no rock, you certainly don't have any. So yes, it's quite a bit, it's predictable. You can basically take the type of rock, the culture history, and the sort of glacial geology, and when you put those 3 together and overlay them, you can predict what the stone walls will look like. And based on my driving around 20,000 miles in one summer, doing a reconnaissance of all the walls in New England, I would say that holds pretty clearly. If you get a hold of that book, you could actually, you know, map it out.
And William has a question, and I think we'll make this our last question for the evening. William asks, do walls display any occasional clues to the intelligence and whimsy of the builders? Or are they simply utility rope piles and stacks made as simply and expediently as possible?
Well, that's again a very interesting question. I don't think it has to be either or. I think there are lots of intermixes there. By and large, if you walk walls around an old field, sometimes they look identical, and that usually means it's money coming from somewhere else. There's a work crew, you know, and laborers that are building to a specified motif, and they can have, you know, art. You know, there can be embellishments or artistic design things in them, or they can all just be plain and simple. But what that usually means is it's not a farm wall. Or you can go to some old pasture walls, and every wall, every 20 feet looks different because it's a different load of stone or built by a different day or by a different person being hired. And so you can see great variety around the old farmsteads that went out really early. And even in those old pasture walls, you can see whimsical things. You can see a stone that's stand on end just for the heck of it, or where there's a pattern. I've seen Dalmatian walls, I've seen cloverleaf walls, I've seen zebra walls, I've seen all pure quartz walls, I've seen just, you name it. There's all kinds of variation that go into it. And if you start looking at masons, you know, professional masons, most of the walls in New England aren't built by masons, they're just built by the people who lived on the land. But if you start looking at masons, they will have their own particular style that can be recognizable. But the vast majority of walls are basically built up from concentrations that accumulated along fence lines. I hope I answered that.
Well, Professor Thorson, thank you so much. And we have a lot of thank yous going on in the chat. Dan has said he enjoyed Stone by Stone very much and the talk. And this has been such an informative talk. And I just want to let everyone know that if you jump on Google tonight and grab Robert Thorson's book, Stone by Stone, The Magnificent History of New England Stone Walls, and Exploring Stone Walls, A Field Guide to New England Stone Walls. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Professor Thorson,
Thank you.
for opening our eyes to stone walls tonight.
There's a lot here. This is like a super overview.
Yes, but it was extremely interesting. So thank you for joining us. And everyone, if you enjoyed this presentation and you'd like to see more public programming from Weston Historical Society, we would love your support. So please visit our website if you'd like to donate.